Today, we are turning this pile of ginger into crisp, refreshing, alcoholic ginger beer. Let's get started. Let's talk ingredients for this ginger beer. We got a whole bunch of fresh ginger. I actually have about 1 kilo here because I don't know how much weight I'm gonna lose after I peeled it, but what I do want is 704 grams, which is gonna give me about 32 grams per liter of beer. I've also got Yeast Nutrients, which is yeast of life, but any yeast nutrient will do the trick. Sultanas, which is gonna help give a little bit of nutrients to the sugary mass that's gonna turn into the beer, as well as a little bit of a flavor kick. Five fresh lemons. I'm gonna use the peel from these first, and then I'm gonna juice them and add the juice into the wash as well. And then lastly, we have yeast. I'm using EC1118, which is a champagne yeast. This is gonna ferment out completely dry, or that's what it should do anyway. And this stuff generally performs a little bit better with high sugar style washes than a typical brewer's yeast. So champagne yeast will really help make sure that we actually get all the sugar fermented from this thing. And then I'll talk later about how we're gonna back sweeten this beer to actually have some sweetness at the end with the finished product. Oh, and sugar, obviously. I'm gonna be using 2 kilos of raw sugar. You can use any sugar you want. I prefer raw sugar. I think it gives a slightly nicer flavor when it's fully fermented out. You don't get a whole lot of flavor when you ferment sugar, honestly, but raw sugar tends to have less of that chemical sharpness on the mouth and in the teeth than white sugar does. So personal preference, I prefer raw sugar. Now, you don't actually need to use a peeler to peel ginger. It's actually much more effective if you use a spoon. You literally just grab the sharp edge, drag it along the ginger, and it just takes the whole skin off with it. So I'm not gonna film us doing all of this because it's gonna take a fair old while, but oh my God, it went in my eyeball. Ah! My eye! Yeah, peel your ginger. Caution, use safety glasses, I don't know. God damn. I gave up on the spoon. It was taking too long. The peeler for that much ginger was more effective, so use a peeler. So that is 714 grams, near enough is good enough. Now I need to peel these lemons. I'm gonna peel the lemon skins, throw them into the fermenter separately, but the sultanas or raisins for the Americans out there and the ginger are gonna get blitzed up in the food processor. So let's do that now. Okay, time to food process. Now you could just chop this up yourself if you were so inclined, but that's gonna take ages. So I'm just gonna whack them in here and blitz this thing up. I don't know if you're meant to chop, well, I need a lid. I don't know if you're meant to chop ginger before you throw them in a food processor, but I don't know, we'll see. There we go. That's not on properly, is it? Am I? Technical difficulties, there we go. Ah, nice. Yeah, it should be good enough. You don't really need it to be like completely tiny pieces. It's just enough to break it down so that you can actually get just more flavor extraction out of it. About that should be good. Pop that into a bowl, rinse and repeat until we're done with all the ginger. Can't get it off? Okay, whatever. All right. Now that all the ginger is done, we're gonna do the same thing with the sultanas. Again, the goal is not really to make it super fine. I just wanna chop up the sultanas a bit so that we actually get some of the flavor extraction out of them and release some of those nutrients that are hiding in there that's gonna help our yeast during fermentation. Because when you are doing like beers with just sugar or a lot of really high gravity beers, the yeast can struggle. So you need to give it a little bit of something to actually help it along the way because there's no nutrients in sugar. So whilst we're adding nutrients, I always do like to add a little bit of natural nutrients as well to help them along. Just added a little bit of water to help that blitz. Apparently sultanas don't like food processors. That's better. All right, now that's chopped up enough. Cool beans. Now, next step, we need to peel some lemons. Now, the goal with peeling these lemons is to try be gentle because I don't want too much pith going in. I want the peels to be like that, where we're avoiding the white part because that pith is what carries bitterness and astringency. Don't really want a ton of that in the ginger beer. It's not the flavors we're going for here. So just try to peel gently so that you're not taking in too much of that white layer, and it's just the outside skin, because that skin is where all the zest lives. So that's where we're going to get a nice bit of freshness coming in. Just giving our ginger ale a little bit of extra kick, a little bit of an extra helping hand. There we go, and that is lemon peeling done. So now that we have the skins, this is good to go into the fermenter. We also need to juice these because we want to make sure that we're using that acidity from the lemons to lower the pH of the beer before the yeast starts fermenting it, because yeast doesn't really like to ferment with really basic stuff. We want that pH range to be around 5.3 kind of territory is pretty good. I'm not going to bother measuring it today, but about 5 lemons is going to help us kind of get towards that. All right, I'm just going to juice it straight into here because we're throwing this whole thing into the fermenter anyway, so it doesn't really matter. There you go. Nice and easy. So after we finish making this, Odin can clean everything up. He's cameraman and janitor, aren't you, Odin? Yeah, I think you're happy to clean up. Nah, you want to clean up first. Team player, man. Teamwork makes the dream work.
Busy boy.
All right, there we go. Now, final step, sugar. We need to dissolve the stuff. All right, now, very conveniently, this is a 2 kilo bag of sugar, and I need 2 kilos of sugar. I don't need to do any measuring, which is awesome. But to help things along, I'm going to dissolve it in a bit of hot water. It will eventually dissolve in the fermenter anyway. Like, sugar is water soluble, so it'll be fine. But just so that we don't have a giant sugar pile sitting at the bottom of the fermenter, let's pour all of our sugar out, pour some hot water on top of it, and just try and help things along so the yeast can get faster access to it. This is 1.7 liters of water. I put 300 mils of water in with the sultanas. And then after all of this, we need to whack a further 20 liters of water into the fermenter for a total of 22 liters of wort. I did get that slightly wrong. It's actually 21 liters total that we're looking for. So we're going to add a further 19 liters of water into the fermenter, which I believe is 5 gallons on the nose, or near enough. All right, let's give that a few minutes to slowly dissolve, and then we'll whack all this into the fermenter. Now, we're going to be using 33 grams of Yeast Life nutrients. Any yeast nutrient will do the trick. This stuff contains a bunch of trace minerals, diammonium phosphate, nitrogen, other stuff. Basically, it's got the stuff that yeast needs to actually perform, grow, have strong cell walls, etc. And there's none of those nutrients in sugar, where normally you could get those nutrients from the grains when you make beer. None of it is in sugar, so we need to replace it with yeast nutrient. Now I'm going to use 33 grams of this stuff, and then alongside those sultanas, that's going to be plenty. So these yeast should be nice and happy. There we go, close enough. 35. It's fine. A little bit of extra food for the yeasties. Okay, now let's whack all this into the fermenter. All right, now we're going to start with adding the sugar. We've already measured out 19 liters of water inside this fermenter. Going to whack the sugar water in first because I do need to take a gravity reading. So I'm going to give that a second to all homogenize, then pull a quick sample out and figure out what our original gravity is, because if you've never brewed beer or made alcohol before, knowing what your specific gravity with the sugar density is at the start before fermentation and then measuring it again at the end with a quick calculation will tell you how much alcohol is in your product. So you can use the calculator on theflyingwombat.com.au to figure out what your ABV is. Now, let's add the rest of the stuff in just a moment. Quick change, Quick change of plans. I'm actually going to add everything in because I did just remember that we're adding sultanas and ginger and stuff, which whilst they're going to have less sugar than, straight up sugar, they do still contain sugar. So let's mix in everything before we do that original gravity reading to figure out what our true starting gravity is. Okay, that's good enough. There we go. Yes, super sanitary. It will be fine. Now the raisin / sultana mixture goes in next. Nice. Lastly, the lemon peels. I'm just going to throw them straight in as is. And we'll give everything a quick mix. Then take some gravity. Now, quick reading. This is called a refractometer if you haven't seen one before. Basically, it's measuring gravity by light density and refraction. So if you don't have one of these, you can also use a hydrometer, so like a test tube looking thing, and then that like glass thing that bobs up and down. Either one is going to give you the same result. That is 1.036. So fermenting out fully dry, this should be about a 4.7%, if my maths is right, somewhere in the realm of 4.5, 4.7% ginger beer, which is bang on the money for what we want for this one. Now let's throw in this yeast nutrients, and then we can pop in some yeast. In the yeast nutrients go. There we go. That's just going to dissolve over time on its own. I'm not too fussed about that. And the yeast goes in lucky last. Quickly rip this open. And in they go. Oh, come on. Nice. Alrighty, now let's close this up and seal it, and we are ready to rock and roll. Now, if you are new to the world of brewing, this thing here is called an airlock. They come in different shapes and sizes, but what it basically does is provide a double layer barrier using water, or I would recommend using a non-rinsing sanitizer like Stella San or phosphoric acid in a small dilution. Whack that into here so that if you do get a bit of this going back into the fermenter, you're not going to contaminate it, so I highly recommend using sanitizer. But what this does is create an airlock so that only carbon dioxide can come out, oxygen doesn't go in, we don't oxidize our beer. So that gets popped on right there, and then we are done. Now, I'm going to let this ferment. It will probably take about a week, maybe bordering close to 2 weeks, depending on how happy the yeast are. Then we'll cut back to where we're kegging this thing and doing the next step to actually add some sweetness back into this ginger ale. See you soon. And we are back. It is now day 7 of fermentation, and it has well and truly finished. Our gravity is sitting at 0.996, which means there is absolutely zero sugar left in this ginger beer to ferment. Now, if you're new to the world of fermentation and making different beverages, what that means is we've got our alcohol sitting in the ginger beer, but there's absolutely zero sugar left because fermentation is the consumption of sugar into carbon dioxide and ethanol. The result of that means that is now a very, very dry drink, and there's zero sweetness. So we need to do what's called back sweetening. Now, traditionally, the issue with adding a bunch of sugar back into the fermenter or into, the keg or into the bottle or however you're going to package it is that yeast is just going to wake up again because there's now fresh food to eat and a bunch of sharks, like a bunch of sharks, that are just going to start eating up all that chum in the water, and then we're going to end up with no sugar left once again. So we've got a little trick to avoid that. The first thing we're doing is we've been letting that fermenter sit and crash out, so all the sediment has dropped down to the bottom of the fermenter. I haven't actually done a full cold crash. If you want me to explain that, I can do so in a separate video. But what we have done is let all the sediment just kind of drop out of suspension and kept that fermenter very still. So now when we transfer it off into the keg, we're going to be transferring a lot of clear liquid, and it's going to have very little yeast left alive in it. It will have a little bit though, and for that, we're going to be using potassium bi-metasulphate and potassium sorbate. Now, these two chemicals are used predominantly in the wine industry quite often because what they are excellent at doing is halting the yeast's ability to keep reproducing. It's not going to kill the yeast that's currently in there, but what it is going to do is stop it from being able to keep duplicating itself and prevent that growth of yeast. So whatever's in there right now would theoretically be able to eat whatever yeast they could, whatever sugar they could before they die, but it's not going to keep reproducing more yeast to keep munching up all the sugars left remaining. So the sediment all dropping out, coupled with this chemical concoction, which is, by the way, 14.25 grams of potassium bi-metasulphate and 14.25 grams of potassium sorbate and 1.79 grams of potassium metabisulphate. The ratios I'll drop, in the recipe and everything down below, link down below for this whole process today. That coupled with then going into the keg, and the keg then being kept at 1 degree Celsius thereafter, means that that yeast really doesn't stand a chance. It is going to fall out to the bottom, it's going to fall asleep, and it's not going to eat up any of this sugar, which means we're going to have a sweet finishing ginger beer at the end of this. Now that all that's done, let's talk about how we're actually going to make this thing. I've done a little bit of math, and I want to back sweeten it to what would theoretically be 1.02 gravity. Now, knowing that means that I need, for the amount of beer that I'm going to be putting into the fermenter, I need about 1 kilogram of sugar. That's totally fine. I could just do the 1 kilogram of raw sugar, and I've already explained why I'm using raw sugar over white sugar, but there's something that I could supplement that with to give a little bit more flavor. Agave syrup. Agave syrup, I know from making cocktails, provides an excellent zestiness, an extra layer of character, extra layer of depth beyond just using literal sugar. It's almost like adding a little bit of lime zest into the final drink. So I think supplementing out the equivalent volume of sugar with a bit of agave syrup is gonna add a nice fun twist that's really gonna complement this ginger ale nicely. Now I'm gonna start with 655 grams of sugar and the 345 grams of agave syrup. I'm gonna melt all this down with a little bit of water to make a really thick syrup. I'm then gonna add all of that to the keg alongside the potassium metabisulphate and potassium sorbate. I'll put links down below, by the way, on where you can find this stuff. Gonna add all of that into the keg, and then I'm going to fill this thing with CO2 to start flushing out any of the oxygen in here before we actually go adding our ginger beer into the keg. Now, let's get to work melting this stuff. First, I'm gonna start by squeezing out all of the agave syrup into this big jug here with all the pre-measured sugar. And then I'm going to start adding hot water incrementally, as little as I can at a time. To be honest, I'm not gonna bother measuring out how much hot water I'm adding. I would say just add enough until you can actually dissolve everything properly without too much of an issue. All right, that should be good. Let's add some hot water. And what we want is a very, very thick sugar syrup. Now we want to add as little water as possible, because the more water we add, the more we're going to dilute not just the alcohol in our ginger ale, but also the total flavor effect. And I don't want to remove too much of that flavor that we've worked so hard to attain. So a nice, very thick syrup, once fully dissolved, will then go into the keg, and then we'll mix in all the other ginger ale, and what we'll end up with is our final product. Now that's looking fairly dissolved. I'm going to add in our potassium metabisulphate and potassium sorbate. Make sure this is fully dissolved as well before it goes into our final product. Okay, now let me explain how this is going to work. I've got the fermenter sitting right here. Coming into the fermenter, I have a tube being pushed by a CO2 tank. So carbon dioxide is going to push into the top of the fermenter. Underneath at the tap here, I've rigged up a beer line connect, which is then going to attach to the inlet of the fermenter itself. On the outlet, I have a pressure release valve. If you don't have things like this, you could literally just release the pressure on the fermenter every now and then as it gets pushed into it. Sorry, release the pressure on the keg every now and then as the beer gets pushed into it. But it is useful to have one of these just so that you can kind of set and forget and not worry about that. So I'm gonna attach that on now. That's basically set to like release gas at like 1 psi, so just enough so that no oxygen is going to get into the keg as I'm pushing this beer in. And the whole reason that I'm doing all of this, by the way, not 100% necessary, but I'm just trying to avoid oxidation. What that means is I'm going to actually have a ginger ale that's just going to last longer and be fresher before all that oxygen gets into it and starts to ruin the flavors, which is something that can happen in the world of brewing if you are new to this or new to the channel. Now let's connect up the the beer inlet, and now we are going to start flowing. So there was about 1 liter of liquid from the sugar syrup concoction thing. So I am going to wait until the scales, which I don't know if you can see that they're at the bottom here, until they hit 18 kilos. So I've already zeroed them out. So that will give us 18 liters of beer, of ginger ale into the keg, at which point I'm gonna shut all this off, put it into the fridge and start cold crashing it so I can serve it for you guys when you see me next. And here it is. It looks absolutely divine. It's bubbling away perfectly and it's so, so fresh. But one thing I do need to point out is I did end up adding another 300 grams of raw sugar and another 651 grams of ginger, because it was just lacking a little bit of gingery kick. All the adjustments are in the recipe in the link down below and on our website. And now it's got that extra sweetness that it kind of needs to balance everything out. Oh, that is so fresh. It's got that zesty, peppery, spicy thing on the back of the throat, like really good fresh ginger ale. but that booze is absolutely hidden. It is very, very deceptive. I would not know that this was an alcoholic ginger beer if I didn't make it myself. So definitely give this one a shot. It's very refreshing. It's gonna be awesome in summer. And I think this one is gonna be an absolute crowd pleaser with you and all of your mates. So cheers, guys. And until next week, happy brewing.